December 15, 1985. Washington, D.C. In less than 4 minutes, 101 of the city's most dangerous fugitives, murder suspects, armed robbers, and career criminals, will be taken into custody without a single shot fired. But right now, they're laughing. Inside a downtown convention center, champagne glasses clink. Cheerleaders pose for photos. A chicken mascot dances between buffet tables. The men in the room believe they've just won free tickets to a sold-out NFL game. What they don't know is that every waiter, every usher, every cheerleader is an undercover U.S. Marshal carrying a concealed weapon. In 45 seconds, a man in a top hat will step to a microphone and say 6 words that will end every escape plan they've ever made. You're all under arrest. Doors will lock. Tactical teams will storm the room. And more than 100 armed fugitives will realize, at the exact same moment, that they've walked straight into a trap. Here's the part that doesn't make sense. These men weren't chased. They weren't cornered. They accepted an invitation, and thanked the people arresting them. So how do you convince the most paranoid criminals in a city to voluntarily show up, unarmed, to their own arrest? To understand why this worked, you have to understand what these men believed, and why that belief made sense at the time. In 1985, Washington, D.C. was overwhelmed by fugitives. More than 250,000 wanted criminals nationwide, hundreds hiding in plain sight across the city. These weren't men crouched in alleys or constantly on the run. Many lived openly in neighborhoods where police cruisers slowed down but rarely stopped. They kept jobs. They had girlfriends. Some were already used to bending the system without consequences. From their perspective, the danger wasn't everywhere. It was specific. Doors kicked in. Late-night knocks. Random traffic stops. If none of that happened, they assumed they were safe. So when an official-looking letter arrived in the mail, clean paper, professional language, a real phone number, it didn't trigger panic. It triggered relief. The invitation didn't demand anything. It didn't threaten them. It didn't even mention law enforcement. It came from what appeared to be a sports media company offering VIP treatment for the hottest team in the city. That mattered. Because law enforcement didn't give out prizes. Police didn't host brunches. And marshals didn't invite fugitives to football parties. In their minds, this wasn't a risk. It was a stroke of luck. What they couldn't see was the reality behind it. A system collapsing under pressure, officers burning out, funerals stacking up, and a federal agency quietly deciding that chasing fugitives one by one was getting people killed. The men walking toward that convention center thought they were being rewarded. In truth, they were stepping into a solution designed to end a crisis by removing their ability to fight back at all. There were reasons not to go. A few of the men noticed them right away. The timing felt strange. The offer was unusually generous. Free tickets to a sold-out Redskins game didn't just appear out of nowhere, especially not with champagne, a VIP brunch, and a Super Bowl raffle attached. For someone living on the run, that kind of attention should have raised alarms. Some fugitives did exactly what survival training had taught them to do. They read the letter once, felt the pull of it, and then threw it away. No reply. No call. No curiosity. They stayed home and stayed free. But most didn't. Because nothing about the invitation forced urgency. It didn't demand money. It didn't ask for personal details beyond an RSVP. It didn't pressure them to act fast. It simply offered something rare, a chance to feel normal, even important. And crucially, it arrived the way real opportunities do, quietly, by mail, with no one watching. For men who had spent months or years dodging danger, that absence of threat mattered. Law enforcement kicked doors. This didn't. Police showed up with sirens. This came with a phone number and polite hold music. So the red flags didn't feel like warnings. They felt like overthinking. Each man made the same small, reasonable decision on his own. If this were a trap, it wouldn't look like this. And that decision, repeated dozens of times by men who thought they were being careful, was exactly what made the operation possible. There was one detail in that invitation none of them ever questioned, because it looked too ordinary to be dangerous. The company hosting the event didn't exist. Flagship International Sports Television sounded legitimate. It fit the era. Cable sports networks were exploding in the mid-1980s, and the name carried just enough authority to feel real without inviting scrutiny. The logo was clean. The language was professional. The tone was confident but friendly. But behind the letterhead, there were no executives, no producers, no tickets. The phone line they called didn't belong to a promotions office. It rang inside a federal task force. The receptionist thanking them for attending wasn't customer service. She was a deputy marshal. The cheerful confirmations, the polite answers, the reassurances, they were all part of the same design. Even the acronym was a lie hidden in plain sight. FIST, the Fugitive Investigative Strike Team. Nothing in the invitation asked the fugitives to trust law enforcement. It didn't need to. It asked them to trust something far more familiar: a corporate offer, a harmless promotion, a reward for being lucky at the right moment. And that's what makes the deception unsettling. No one forged signatures. No one threatened consequences. No one pretended to be a cop. The lie worked because it didn't feel like a lie at all. It felt like the system, advertising, promotions, sports culture, doing what it always does. By the time the men realized Flagship was fiction, they were already standing inside the building that would end their freedom. What the marshals exploited wasn't intelligence. It was something simpler and harder to fight. Imagine a man who's been holding his breath for years. Every knock at the door could be police. Every siren could be for him. Every friend could be a mistake. Now imagine someone opens a window. That's what the invitation felt like. It didn't promise freedom. It promised a morning where nothing bad would happen. A place with food, music, and people smiling at you instead of watching you. A moment where you weren't hiding. That's why the phone started ringing. At first, one call. Then another. Then dozens. Each man thought he was making a personal decision. But the choice wasn't personal at all. It was the same choice repeated over and over. Do I stay alone and suspicious, or do I take one safe step back into the world? Most chose the step. Some even asked if they could bring their girlfriends. Others asked what to wear. One wanted to know about the buffet. These weren't reckless questions. They were normal ones, asked by people who, for once, believed they were allowed to act normal. And once that belief took hold, the outcome became unavoidable. Because the trap didn't rely on speed or force. It relied on gravity. When enough people lean in the same direction, toward comfort, recognition, and relief, you don't have to push them. You just have to stand where they're already headed. At this point, the story splits into two groups moving in opposite directions, without either side fully seeing the other. On one side were the men receiving the invitations. Each of them believed he had discovered something. A break. A reward. Proof that the world hadn't completely closed its doors. In their minds, they were choosing to attend. Acting on luck. Acting early. Getting ahead of everyone else. They saw themselves as discoverers. On the other side was a group watching those decisions accumulate. Quietly. Methodically. Not chasing. Not reacting. Just observing patterns form. They weren't hunting individual men. They weren't interested in one arrest at a time. They were designing a space where decisions would converge. Every confirmation call wasn't a victory. It was a data point. Each RSVP showed how predictable people become when offered relief instead of pressure. The goal wasn't to surprise anyone yet. It was to let momentum build until walking away felt harder than walking in. That difference in motive mattered. The men accepting the invitations were trying to regain control of their lives, even briefly. The ones receiving the calls were trying to remove the need for force altogether. No one was thinking about violence in the same way. One group believed they were stepping into an opportunity. The other was building a room where fighting would no longer be an option. There was a point when the operation stopped being an idea and became a countdown. It happened quietly. 10 days after the invitations went out, the numbers crossed a line. More than 160 confirmed replies. Dozens more expected to arrive without responding. Enough people that the room would be full. Enough that canceling now would be more dangerous than continuing. From that moment on, nothing could be adjusted without consequences. Every man who confirmed was potentially armed. Every new RSVP increased the risk. And every hour that passed made backing out impossible. The date was locked. December 15th, 1985. The location was secured. The ballroom reserved. The personnel scheduled. Once the undercover assignments were issued, there was no pause button. Officers were coming from across the country. Costumes were ordered. Tactics were rehearsed. If the plan failed, it wouldn't fail quietly. It would fail all at once, in a room full of desperate men. That's what made it irreversible. No single fugitive could stop it. No single officer could call it off. The machine was already moving. From that point forward, the only question left wasn't whether something would happen inside that convention center. It was whether anyone would be able to stop it once the doors closed. The first man arrived an hour early. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't nervous. He was smiling. He stepped through the convention center doors just after 8 a.m., invitation in hand, expecting nothing more than coffee, food, and the feeling that, for once, he was ahead of the game. A cheerleader greeted him with a wide smile and an enthusiastic hug. In those few seconds, she confirmed what mattered most. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He never noticed. He was guided to a registration table. His name was checked. A bright name tag was pinned to his chest. He walked inside, poured himself coffee, and waited for the rest of the winners to arrive. That moment set the tone for everything that followed. More men came in, one by one. Then in pairs. Then in clusters. Each arrival repeated the same quiet ritual. Greeting, registration, food, relief. No alarms. No suspicion. No resistance. By mid-morning, the ballroom held more than 100 wanted fugitives, the largest concentration of them ever assembled in Washington, D.C. Men wanted for armed robbery stood in line for scrambled eggs. Murder suspects laughed at the mascot. Career criminals clinked champagne glasses and talked football. What made it unsettling wasn't the celebration. It was how ordinary it looked. These were men who had lived with constant tension, watching windows, flinching at sirens, sleeping lightly. And now, surrounded by music and color and people treating them like guests, that tension dissolved. As each new arrival stepped inside, the balance shifted. This was no longer a test. No longer a gamble. The room was full. The exits were controlled. And without knowing it, every man who entered made the outcome more certain, not just for himself, but for everyone else in the room. The operation hadn't ended yet. But by the time the last guest arrived, it no longer could. What's striking about the moment before the arrest isn't the chaos, it's how calm everything still is. By the time the ballroom fills, the system that created this situation is already insulated from consequence. The invitations have done their job. The men inside the room have made their choices. And the structure surrounding them is locked into place. No warning signs trigger alarms. No supervisor steps in to stop it. No external check intervenes. The institutions involved will continue functioning no matter what happens next. The federal agency will still exist. The building will still host events. The city will wake up the next morning and move on. But the men in that room won't. They are the ones who will absorb the outcome personally, through handcuffs, courtrooms, and years lost. Not because they were forced, but because they trusted something that looked ordinary and safe. That's the imbalance. Systems can experiment. People carry the cost. As the master of ceremonies steps toward the microphone and the exits quietly lock, there is no appeals process left. No reconsideration. No second chance to walk away. The structure survives either way. Only the individuals inside the room are about to find out what they've lost. When the arrests begin, what's exposed isn't just a successful sting, it's a pattern that extends far beyond that ballroom. Nothing about this outcome required extraordinary force. No doors were kicked. No weapons were fired. The men inside didn't lose because they were overpowered in a fight. They lost because the system learned how to remove the fight entirely. This wasn't about football tickets. It was about predictability. When pressure becomes constant, people don't look for danger, they look for relief. And institutions that understand that don't need to chase individuals. They can wait for behavior to repeat itself at scale. That's the failure underneath the story. The same structures that allowed hundreds of fugitives to live openly also created the conditions that made them vulnerable to a single, coordinated move. Years of evasion taught them how to avoid threats, but not how to question rewards. And that's why this method works again and again. Change the tickets. Change the setting. Change the names. The mechanism stays the same. Offer recognition instead of force. Offer comfort instead of pressure. And let people step forward on their own, believing they've found an exception, when they've actually entered a system designed to close behind them. What happened in Washington wasn't a one-time trick. It was proof that once a pattern is discovered, it doesn't disappear. It gets reused. ACT 11, closing the loop, beat 18. When the last pair of handcuffs clicked shut, the room went quiet. In under 4 minutes, 101 fugitives were on the floor, alive, unharmed, and stunned. Outside, school buses waited to take them to processing. Above the exit doors, a banner still hung in place, reading, "Congratulations." The institution moved on. The building would host another event. The agency would file its reports. The strategy would be studied, copied, and reused. The men who walked into that room would not. What ended them wasn't force or speed. It was a moment of relief they couldn't resist. A chance to feel chosen instead of hunted. A reward that never existed. They didn't get chased down. They didn't get cornered. They stepped forward. And that's the lesson that lingers beyond this case, because the same pressure, the same loneliness, and the same desire to believe in a harmless opportunity still exist. So the question isn't whether this could happen again. It's where it already has, and who's next to mistake relief for safety. When it was over, the convention center didn't look like the site of a historic arrest. The banners were still hanging. The buffet tables were still set. The word, "Congratulations," still framed the exit. In less than 4 minutes, 101 fugitives had been taken into custody without a single shot fired. Not because they were hunted down, but because they accepted something that felt safe, ordinary, even generous. They weren't overpowered. They weren't outnumbered. They trusted the wrong signal. So here's the question worth sitting with. If pressure makes people look for relief instead of risk, how often do the most effective traps look like opportunities? Because this wasn't just a clever sting. It was a demonstration. One that's been repeated in different forms, by institutions, by criminals, and by systems that understand how predictable human behavior becomes under stress. And if you think this was the most ingenious operation ever pulled off without violence, the next story flips the equation. Instead of law enforcement using psychology to close a trap, you'll see criminals using the same principles to walk out with millions, without forcing a single door. That story is waiting in the video on the most genius heist ever.